It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. George Orwell, 1984. George Orwell's 1984 is considered by most to be one of the best dystopian fiction novels, even considered by some to be a classic. The comparison of such a highly praised work of fiction to today's modern world is so jarring in that it's nearly impossible to draw any sort of clear similarities, unless the area of the world being compared is already in a state of authoritarian oppression. That said, even more ludicrous is the comparison of that to modern-day social justice and its effects on America, the very topic of these videos. Social justice, in its modern form, is trying to institute a 1984-style dystopia upon America, through the bias in mainstream and liberal medias and through social media websites deplatforming those going against the narrative of modern social justice. Such a topic on its own is very conspiratorial a statement to make, and while there is a multitude of evidence to support such a claim, this video will focus mainly on setting up the background for the issue, with another video following up to look in depth on the case of James Damore, his infamous Google memo, the resulting backlash from the media, and comparing that case with recent changes to various social media platforms. That said, before we can begin, we need to define what social justice is, as certain definitions have changed over recent times. What exactly is social justice? Well, the Encyclopedia of Contemporary American Social Issues defines social justice as the following. Social justice can be described as either an end goal, an action, and a form of activism. There is a path to social justice, an act of social justice, and the activism of social justice. I will be referring mostly to the lattermost version of social justice as a form of activism. I will refer to classic movements of social justice by their respective names, and I will also refer to mainstream or liberal news media under the names social justice or modern social justice, because they appear to push a lot of the same points as social justice in its modern form does. In America, there have been many movements for social justice. There's been the first and second waves of feminism, the American Civil Rights Movement, and abolitionism, just to name a few. And even America's separation from the British could be seen as a social movement, with the oppressed colonists escaping the tyrannical rule of an authoritarian regime. Modern-day social justice, however, has two main differences between the social movements of the past. The first difference between those social movements as compared to modern-day social justice is that all of those movements had an end goal. First-wave feminism had the end goal of getting women voting and property rights. Second-wave feminism gave women reproductive rights, equality of pay, and brought attention to domestic violence and marital rape. The Civil Rights Movement brought an end to discrimination of pay based on race, the creation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and abolished racial segregation in America, and abolitionism brought an end to slavery. Modern-day social justice, however, has no end goal, or at the very least, their goal is an impossible task to accomplish socially, such as ending racism or sexism. The whole point about social justice has changed from actually identifying injustices of inequality within America and trying to change them, to harassing and ostracizing anyone that doesn't follow their narrative, even those that they claim to be fighting for. However, before one can talk about such matters as comparing a social movement in America to George Orwell's esteemed book 1984, it is imperative to first define a fair few words that will appear within this essay and on various extra readings on the topic of social justice. Racism, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. A doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles, or racial prejudice or discrimination. Sexism, prejudice or discrimination based on sex, especially discrimination against women. Behavior, conditions, or attitudes that foster stereotypes of social roles based on sex. Misogyny, a hatred of women. Feminism, the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. Organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. Nazi, a member of the German Fascist Party controlling Germany from 1933 to 1945 under Adolf Hitler. One who espouses the beliefs and policies of the German Nazis, or B, one who is likened to a German Nazi, a harshly domineering, dictatorial, or intolerant person. The reason for this is that in recent years, as the movement of social justice has become more authoritarian in nature, they've seen fit to change the definitions of those words so as to not only label any persons opposing them with their definitions of the words, but to also have themselves exempt from their own definitions. The definition of racism and sexism that is now used by a fair amount of those fighting for social justice has followed a different rule: prejudice plus power. Essentially, the rule works as follows. Racism, and by extension sexism, can be understood as prejudice plus power. This view maintains that prejudice is widespread and commonplace, but only some have the capacity or power to act upon their prejudices to produce discriminatory outcomes. This definition of racism and sexism allows those pushing for social justice to enact racism or sexism upon their opposition without fear of backlash from their constituents. Since they are fighting for those who are oppressed, the minority, it is impossible for them to be racist or sexist towards their opponents. Because they hold no power with which to enact their discrimination, therefore, they cannot be racist. The second difference between the social movements of the past and modern-day social justice is that social justice, or at least the ideals of social justice, such as equality of pay and non-discrimination against people based on race or gender, are mainstream. This leaves modern social justice with little to actually do in the name of equality, which leads them to fight for every small victory they possibly can, thus the authoritarian nature. This, in part, has led to the creation of a veritable smorgasbord of new terms with which to deceive those who do not know the version of the meaning used by those fighting for social justice. The following definitions of the terms on screen are my interpretations of said terms. If these definitions are not representative of what they actually mean, please comment down below and correct me. I will leave a link in the description to a Google Doc where you can access the citations that I use for these definitions, as well as browse additional reading on the subject. Equity. A measurement of equality of outcome of a given area. Essentially, if any person within a given area has an equal chance of being successful as any other person, that area is very equitable, and vice versa. Nazi. One who supports Donald Trump. A member of the alt-right, a white nationalist. A male of Caucasian descent that does not agree with modern social justice. Someone who browses 4chan or uses the Pepe the Frog meme. The alt-right. A loose group of individuals mostly residing in the US, but to also lesser extents in Canada and Europe, who believe in preserving the white race, limited government, low taxes, and strict law and order. Or, a synonym of Nazi. Pepe the Frog. A somewhat crudely drawn green frog can express a wide array of emotions, mostly found on the website 4chan, and has been associated with the alt-right, although that connection is mostly contextual. Microaggression. Behaviors or statements that do not necessarily reflect malicious intent, but which nevertheless can inflict insult or injury. Cultural appropriation. The adoption or use of elements of one culture by members of another culture. Racism. See prejudice plus power. Sexism. See prejudice plus power. Social justice has, in essence, created their own form of newspeak ripped straight from 1984 itself, even going so far as to believe in a doublethink way, wherein one knows of two contradictory points and believes both of them. But the comparisons between social justice and the Ingsoc of 1984 don't end there. While Ingsoc and the party hold the view that their society is being subverted in its core values by Goldstein and the Brotherhood, social justice has created, through the liberal and mainstream media and through liberal college professors, a viewpoint that the United States is being subverted in its core values by Donald Trump and the right wing, sometimes also called the alt-right. This is bolstered by the fact that some who ascribe to the narrative of social justice believe that Donald Trump is, quite literally, on a similar level to Adolf Hitler. This has therefore led to the view that the United States is becoming a fascist Nazi-controlled regime. The doublethink occurs in that while they believe that they are an oppressed class, given that historically those fighting for social justice have always been oppressed by those in power, at the same time the liberal news media or mainstream media such as CNN, the Huffington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and those running various social media platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, are very popular among the population of America. That said, all of what this video just went over is background information, and doesn't really hold meaningful weight unless given specific cases to observe. So let's take a look at the case of James Damore, an employee at Google who recently released a 10-page memo in July on the company's internal forums. The memo was leaked early in August to the public, leading to an uproar from the media, and Damore's subsequent firing. Please take careful note of the subtle or overt biases from the publications this essay will provide, as well as biases in any reading you as a reader might do while researching the case.